The Reformation of the Canadian Senate by Courtney Clement. The Canadian Senate is an area of government that many Canadians have little knowledge on. In fact, its necessity has been long debated, especially so over the last 40 years. Senators are Canadian citizens over the age of 30 who own at least $4,000 worth of property in the province he or she is elected in. To put simply, their job is to review legislation and provide improvements and fix any mistakes in the proposed legislation, and to keep the powers of the federal government in check to avoid abuses of the power. The Canadian Senate is meant to be the power that checks that of the Canadian federal government. However, over the years, the Canadian Senate has not remained popular with citizens. It has received increasingly negative feedback for its actions since its formation. This is because the Canadian Senate is flawed in its current design and requires reformation in order to better serve its purpose in the Canadian government. The largest problem with the Canadian Senate is the fact that senators, unlike MPs, need not to compete in the electoral arena. Instead, senators are elected by the Governor-General on the advice of the Prime Minister. The problem here is senators then owe no loyalty to Canadian citizens because they had little to do with their appointment. The installation of senators by the federal government creates a lack of representation and loyalty to the regions they are meant to represent. Section 22 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms states that senators shall represent their province in the Parliament of Canada, and under Section 30, senators are given the right to resign from their position should they feel they are not properly representing the will of the authority who put them in power. This would be the perfect way to run the Senate, if senators were not meant to represent the will of the federal government. Senators are put in power by the Governor-General and the Prime Minister, so they owe no loyalty to the provinces they are meant to represent. Senators could resign if they felt that they were not representing the wishes of the Canadian people, but it is not required since Canadians are not the authority who put them there. This is where Canadians see the Senate fail and have a hard time putting their trust into that area of government. It is also the largest downfall of the Senate. The ability of the Senate to keep the power of the federal government in check is failing because of where the Senate owes all of its loyalty to. The federal government is then given too much power and makes the very nature of the Senate undemocratic. The area of Canada that most strongly demands the reformation of the Senate is Western Canada. Their intention is to receive more of a voice in the Reformation. Initially, when the Senate was formed, its role was to protect the interests of Quebec. But now with Canadians' desire to be more unified, they need to feel properly and fairly represented in the government. The argument that the Canadian Senate should not be reformed because it is part of a delicate and complicated system established in 1867 can be made irrelevant, as so much has changed the Constitution since then, such as Canada having 6 new provinces and territories, the adoption of universal suffrage, and the enhancement of judicial review through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So what major change can be made to the Canadian Senate in order to justify its worth? So far, the most popular solution is to create a Triple E Senate, a Senate that is equal, elected, and effective. The Triple E Senate is the most popular because it best meets the needs of Canadians. In 1989, the Alberta government felt so strongly that an elected Senate would be more effective, they held a senatorial election, when a vacancy opened and Prime Minister Mulroney asked for provincial nominees. Stan Waters, the Reform Party candidate, won the election and was eventually made a senator in 1990. By allowing Canadians to elect their own senators, the fear of not having the senator's loyalty is removed. When senators no longer represent the will of the electing authority, Canadians, they will be pressured to step down and be replaced with someone who does. Senators would now owe their loyalty to Canadian citizens instead of to the federal government. The Senate would finally be a check to the power of the federal government, like it was meant to be. The Senate cannot have a proper impact on Canadian legislature unless it, like the House of Commons, is a product of democratic electoral choice-making. A former British Columbia premier suggested each province should be recognized as its own distinct society and allow them to elect senators themselves. The Canadian Senate is currently failing in its attempt to serve Canadian people because of its inability to keep the power of the federal government in check, because its loyalty lies with the elected power, the federal government. The proposed change is to have an elected Senate, one where Canadians vote for their senators of their regions.